On traditional waterfall project management, changes are considered based on the magnitude of their variation from a baseline value. Now, in project management, project managers are given certain defined tolerance levels within which to manage changes. But when a change request exceeds the defined tolerance levels, the project manager is expected to escalate the change to higher levels of management, typically called the change control board, who will then look into the issue and decide whether the change must be implemented or not. The project manager in this instance will await their decision before implementing the change. Now, once a change is approved by the change control board, the project manager has the responsibility of implementing the change according to the instructions or the directions given to it. That is what is done on traditional waterfall project management. But in agile project management, agile methodologies, right from the word go, are developed in the environment of change. The context of change is considered for even the development of agile methodologies. So changes are handled differently on agile methodologies than they are on waterfall methodologies. Now, this video explores how changes are handled on agile projects. Before we get into the details, let me do a quick overview of the Agile framework, especially for those who are still not clear about the framework. So this is the product backlog. This is where we break down the project vision statement into epics, okay, epics or large user stories, and with constant customer collaboration. When these items within the backlog are implemented, business value will be created. Now, after that, we would select some elements within this product backlog and feed it into a sprint planning in order to create a sprint backlog. So, for instance, if we authorize a sprint, let's say sprint 1, we determine based on the release management schedule if we are to execute sprint within 2 weeks. Remember, sprints can be delivered within a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or a maximum of 4 weeks. All right. So we decide the duration of the sprint. So for instance, if we agree that we will be implementing in 2 weeks for every sprint, we select as many user stories that can be completed within 2 weeks. Okay, many epics or large user stories that can be completed within 2 weeks. Okay, and that is what we break down into user stories and tasks within the sprint backlog, which is fed into execution. So we execute the sprint here and then we test. And once we have tested to meet the acceptance criteria, we perform a sprint review or demonstration in order to validate the outcome, that feature increment. If it is good, then it's a potentially shippable increment to the client. If it's not good, whatever issue we uncover, it is fed into the sprint backlog, okay, for it to be addressed, okay. And then, of course, after every sprint demonstration, we perform a sprint retrospective in order to uncover areas that require improvement so the team can become better and better. So this is the generic agile framework. We begin with changes in priorities. What if the customer changes his priorities? What happens and how do we handle that change in agile development? Now, changes in priorities are spearheaded by the product owner. Now, within this product backlog, the product owner, who also represents the customer or is also called the voice of the customer, he or she has the responsibility of performing backlog grooming or refinement, so that whenever there are changes in priorities, those changes in priorities can take effect whilst he or she is performing the backlog grooming. Now, what is backlog grooming or reprioritization? Now, what that means is that from time to time, the product owner revisits the product backlog in order to confirm the priority of the works there, the order by which they have been positioned. Because in agile development, the works that are most needed appear on top. What is most pressing to the client appears on top and is fed into the next sprint. Okay, but it's the responsibility of the product owner to determine and make known the voice of the customer to the T by performing backlog grooming or reprioritization. Okay, by moving. So from time to time, the product owner keeps moving because I told you when it comes to agile development, we respond to change. Maybe for today, this work is the top priority, the topmost priority. But tomorrow, a change in the project environment may not make it priority anymore. In which case, we may have to deprioritize that and make what is priority today appear on top. So that is what we keep doing. So whenever there are changes in priorities, the product owner would shift work, reorder the work, so that only the ones that are pressing, only the ones that are most needed appear on top of the product backlog. The next thing we want to look at has to do with changes to a sprint. Whenever there is a change request to a sprint that is already in progress, okay, so there is a sprint that is already being executed and then there is a change request to it. Typically on agile project, what we do is that every change is fed into the product backlog to be reconsidered for a later sprint. That is what we do. Every change is fed back into the product backlog to be reconsidered for a future sprint or a later sprint. Okay, but sometimes depending on the nature of the change or the degree of urgency, we can't wait for a sprint to complete before we attend to that situation. So what happens is that whenever there is a change request to a sprint, the product owner, in consultation with relevant stakeholders, will measure the degree of urgency. If it is that urgent, the current sprint in progress is terminated immediately and the issue is attended to. If not, then we would have to wait for the sprint to complete before the issue which has been fed into the product backlog is attended to. The next thing we look at is when there is a change request to include new features or functionalities. What happens? Now, if there is a request to include new features or functionalities, the product owner will include it in the product backlog. But then we would also want to determine the degree of urgency or the priority that we associate to those new features and functionalities. Sometimes those new features may be needed immediately, okay, in which case they may appear on top of the product backlog. Other times, although they are important, some other items within the product backlog may still be more important. So these new features may be positioned somewhere within the product backlog depending on their degree of urgency or priority. But take note that new features and functions added to the product backlog may even make some existing items within the product backlog irrelevant, and they may eventually fall out of the product backlog entirely. Okay, anytime there is an inclusion, we perform reprioritization to determine the positions of every item within the product backlog. The final thing we look at has to do with issues. Issues that are uncovered during sprint reviews or demonstration. What do we do? Whenever there is an issue, okay, and for which reason the feature increment cannot be finalized, the issue is fed back into the product backlog or the sprint backlog to be reworked on. Okay, Ideally, they are fed into the product backlog to be considered on the next sprint, depending on the degree of urgency. Okay. Now, issues uncovered during sprint reviews or demonstrations may be defects, they may be bugs, or they may be situations that no longer satisfy the customer's interest. Okay. And whatever the situation is, it is fed into the product backlog to be considered in order to create the intended value. Yes, so that will be it for the entire Agile Project Management series. I hope you have followed through the lessons. I hope you have enjoyed it. And I hope you are seriously preparing for the various Agile certifications. If you need help, if you need support, look for me whilst I may still be found. And remember, I love you. Bye-bye.